No, I also run the church's youth ministry.
I work a lot with the youth ministry, and your Aunt Tanya told me a lot about you.
I saw our youth ministry.
We have the youth ministry on Thursdays.
This program is made possible by financial support from viewers like you.
Welcome to the ride!
Welcome back to Babbling on in Babylon. My name is Will, and I'm an aspired follower of Yeshua HaMashiach. You might know him as Jesus Christ. And this is the place where we try to make sense of a world that honestly feels like it's upside down half the time. By grounding ourselves in truth, asking real questions, and not being afraid to look under the hood of things. Even the stuff people don't like to talk about. And today, we're stepping into something that, depending on who you ask, was either one of the most powerful youth movements in modern American Christianity, or something that went way off the rails. We're talking about Teen Mania. Now, maybe you've heard that name before, maybe you haven't. But I can pretty much guarantee this. Whether you realize it or not, what happened with Teen Mania has shaped a lot of what you see in youth ministries today. So what I want to do in this first segment is just lay it all out. No spin, no exaggeration. Just, what was it? Where did it come from? And why did it blow up the way it did? So let's rewind a bit. Teen Mania Ministries was founded back in 1986 by a guy named Ron Luce, that's Luce, and his wife, Katie, down in Texas. And on the surface, the mission sounds pretty straightforward. They wanted to reach teenagers, get them fired up about their faith, and mobilize them to go out and change the world. Nothing unusual there, right? That's basically every youth pastor's mission statement since forever. But here's where Teen Mania started to separate itself. They didn't just want teens who believed. They wanted teens who were all in. Like, no half measures, no sitting on the sidelines, no casual Sunday morning only faith. They used language like radical, sold out, revolutionary. And that tone wasn't just marketing, it was the heartbeat of everything they did. Now, if you were a teenager in the 90s or early 2000s, there's a good chance you heard about, or even went to, something called Acquire the Fire. And this is really where Teen Mania made its name. Picture this. You've got thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of teenagers packed into an arena. Lights, music, speakers, dramatic presentations. It felt part church service, part concert, part full-on rally. But the core message was always the same. You are here for a reason. The world is broken, and God is calling you to step up and do something about it. And man, for a teenager trying to figure out who they are, that hits. That hits hard. And to be fair, a lot of good came out of that. There were kids who walked away from destructive lifestyles. There were kids who got serious about their faith for the first time. There were kids who felt like, okay, my life actually matters. And honestly, that part shouldn't be dismissed. Because purpose is powerful. But Teen Mania didn't stop at weekend events. They built an entire system around this ideal of radical commitment. One of their biggest programs was something called Global Expeditions. And this is where teenagers would go on short-term mission trips all over the world. Now again, this sounds pretty normal today, but back then, Teen Mania helped make this kind of thing mainstream. They weren't just saying, hey, believe something. They were saying, go, do something, live it out. And that resonated with a lot of people. But then, there was the piece that really defines the conversation today. The Honor Academy. This was their gap year program. And on paper, it was about leadership development. Young adults would come in, live on campus, raise their own support, and go through a year, or sometimes longer, of training. Spiritual training, leadership training, character development. But here's where things start to shift. Because this wasn't your typical Bible school environment. This was intense. Like, really intense. We're talking structured schedules, strict rules, heavy accountability, and a culture that pushed people physically, emotionally, and spiritually to their limits. And depending on who you talk to, that's either where the real transformation happened or where things started going sideways. Now, before we get into any of that deeper stuff, and we will later on in this episode, it's important to understand the mindset behind it. Teen Mania wasn't operating from a place of, let's make people comfortable. It was more like, the world is falling apart and we don't have time to play games. They believed that most of what passed for faith in the West was lukewarm, compromised, too comfortable. And their answer was to swing hard in the opposite direction. Discipline, sacrifice, intensity, urgency. They wanted to raise what they basically saw as a generation of spiritual warriors. And if you zoom out for a second, you start to see why this took off. Because the late 90s into the 2000s was a weird time. You had Columbine, you had 9/11, you had the internet starting to reshape everything. There was this underlying sense that things just weren't stable, that something was shifting. And Teen Mania stepped right into that moment and said, you're not crazy for feeling that. The world is broken, and you were born for a time like this. That's a powerful message. They also leaned heavily into what you could call spiritual warfare language. Everything was framed like a battle, not in a physical sense, but in a moral, cultural, and spiritual sense. You'd hear phrases like, fight the culture, stand for truth, be a soldier. And for a lot of teenagers, that gave them identity. It gave them direction. And it gave them a sense of belonging to something bigger than themselves. But here's the thing, and this is where we need to stay grounded. None of this, at its core, was outside of broader evangelical Christianity. I mean, belief in the Bible, salvation through Yeshua, evangelism, holiness, mission work. Those are all standard. I mean, isn't that solid? Well, what made Teen Mania different wasn't what they believed. It was how hard they pushed it and how they structured the environment around it. As the movement grew, it got big, like really big. We're talking millions of teens reached through events, massive conferences across the country, a pipeline of young people going into missions and ministry. At one point, this thing was one of the most influential youth movements in the United States. Not a niche group, a major player. But, and you probably already know this, that kind of rapid growth usually comes with pressure. And pressure reveals things. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. And that's where the story starts to turn. Because while all this was happening on the surface, big events, big energy, big impact, there were also things happening underneath that people didn't see right away. And that's what we're going to start unpacking in the next segment. We're going to get into the theology behind it, what they were really teaching, how they framed things like authority, obedience, and sacrifice, and why, for some people, that became a problem. But for now, just sit with this. Teen Mania wasn't some fringe group or operating in the shadows. It was right out in the open, influencing a generation, shaping how young people thought about faith, purpose, and the world around them. And whether you see it as something that was genuinely trying to be good and do good, or something that went too far, there's no denying this. It left a mark. Alright, we'll pick this back up on the flip side of this here break. Because once you understand what they believed, how they operated internally, a lot of the rest of this story starts to make a whole lot more sense. Stick around.
We're tuning in tonight, where the truth and the rumors collide in the light. From prophecy to mystery, we got it going on. Welcome to the sound of Babylon. Babbling on in Babylon. The stories keep rolling, the beat goes on. From shadows deep to the break of dawn, we keep babbling, babbling on. The page, ancient words on the mic. Conspiracies keep rolling, the beat goes on. From shadows deep to the break of dawn, we keep babbling, babbling on. Flip the page, ancient words on the mic. Conspiracies, prophecies, ride through the night. From heart to the heavens, the signs in the sky. Asking the questions they don't want you to try. Truth ain't clean, it's a puzzle and a fight. But we crack it wide open when the time is right. Whispers in the dark, voices in the dawn. Welcome to the chaos, Babylon storm. Babbling on in Babylon. The stories keep rolling, the beat goes on. From shadows deep to the break of dawn, we keep babbling, babbling on.
Now that we got a solid picture of what Teen Mania was on the surface, we need to go a layer deeper. We need to talk about what was actually being taught. Not just the events, not just the hype, but the theology underneath it all. Because here's the thing. What people believe shapes how they act. And if you don't understand the beliefs driving something like this, you're gonna miss the whole story. So first, let's clear something up right out of the gate. Teen Mania wasn't some brand new religion. They weren't out there rewriting scripture or introducing some secret doctrine. On paper, they sat pretty comfortably inside mainstream evangelical Christianity. We're talking the Bible's authoritative. Salvation comes through Yeshua. You need to be born again. Go out and share your faith. All of that? Standard. Nothing controversial there. So, if the foundation looked normal, where did things start to feel different? It comes down to emphasis. Teen Mania didn't necessarily teach different things. They turned the volume way up on certain things. And the biggest one? Radical commitment. They pushed this ideal that following Yeshua isn't supposed to be comfortable. It's not supposed to fit neatly into your life. It's supposed to take over your life. And to be fair, there is scripture that supports that kind of thinking. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and count the cost. That language is real. But Teen Mania took that and framed it in a way that said, if your faith doesn't cost you something, it might not be real. Now, depending on how that's handled, that can either be deeply convicting or deeply crushing. And that tension is very important. Because a lot of people who went through this came out saying, that woke me up. I needed that. And others came out saying, that totally broke me. Same message, different outcomes. Another big emphasis was holiness. And when I say holiness, I'm talking about a very strong focus on moral purity. This included things like sexual purity, modesty, avoiding worldly influences, guarding your thoughts. And again, none of that is new, and none of that is wrong. That's been part of certain streams of believers' teachings for a long time. But in Teen Mania, it wasn't just encouraged, it was constantly reinforced. There was this underlying sense that sin wasn't just something to avoid. It was something that could completely derail your life if you didn't stay on top of it. And frankly, they're not far off base. So you ended up with a culture of constant self-examination. Always checking yourself. Always asking, am I slipping? Am I compromising? Am I fully surrendered? And then there's the piece that really defined the tone of everything else. Spiritual warfare. Teen Mania leaned hard into this ideal that we are in a battle. Not metaphorically, in a light sense, but in a very real and active sense. A battle for your mind, your soul, your generation, your culture. And so everything got framed through that lens. Music wasn't just music, it was influence. Media wasn't just entertainment, it was shaping your worldview. Culture wasn't neutral, it was either pulling you toward truth or away from it. And when you combine that with young people trying to figure out life, it can create urgency and it can create intensity. Because if not delivered correctly, with care, compassion, discernment, it now becomes not just make good choices, but it's you're on a battlefield. What you do matters right now. That's also where the soldier language comes in. And this is important, because the language you use shapes how people think. When you start talking about war, battle, soldiers, sacrifice, you're not just describing something, you're creating a mindset that says, comfort is not the goal, obedience is, endurance is, sacrifice is. Now, here's where things start to get a little more complicated. Authority and submission. Inside the Honor Academy, especially, there was a strong emphasis on leadership authority. The ideal was that God places leaders over you for your growth. And trusting them, even when it's hard, is part of trusting God. Again, there are scriptures people point to for that. But in practice, this meant that students were expected to follow instructions, accept correction, stay teachable, not push back too much. And on the surface, that sounds like discipline. But depending on how it's applied, that can drift into something else. Because there's a difference between healthy accountability and unquestioned authority. And that line, it can get blurry real fast. Another key piece was confession and accountability culture. Students were encouraged, sometimes expected, to be very open about their struggles, sin, doubts, weaknesses. The ideal was that bringing things into the light leads to freedom. And again, that's a biblical concept. But in a highly structured environment, it can also create pressure. Because now you're not just dealing with God, you're dealing with a system, a group, leaders, peers, and that changes the dynamic. Then there's the emotional side of all this. Teen Mania leaned heavily into experiential faith. We're talking emotional worship, altar calls, public moments of surrender, shared hardship. And those experiences can be powerful. They can be genuine. They can mark people in real ways. But they can also be intense. And when emotion and beliefs are tightly connected, it can become hard to separate what is truly conviction from what am I feeling in the moment. Now let's zoom out for just a second, because when you put all this together, you get a very specific kind of environment. You've got high commitment, strong authority, constant accountability, emotional intensity, a sense of urgency, a belief that you're in a battle. And that combination, it's powerful. It can produce discipline, purpose, clarity, but it can also produce pressure, fear, and burnout. And here's the key point. The theology itself wasn't the issue for most people. It's how it was applied, how it was structured, how it was lived out day to day. Because you can take the same core beliefs and build a healthy environment. Or you can take those same beliefs and create something that feels heavy, controlling, or overwhelming. And that's exactly where the conversation starts to shift. Because once you understand this foundation, you can start to see how some of the things people later described, the pressure, the intensity, the control, didn't just come out of nowhere. They grew out of this system. Now, to be fair, not everyone experienced it the same way. Some people thrived in that environment. They came out stronger, more focused, more grounded in their faith. Others came out with a very different story. And that's what we're going to get into next. We're going to separate what is actually documented from what is alleged, and what falls somewhere in between. And we're going to do that very carefully, because this is where things can get messy if you're not paying attention to the road ahead. So refresh your refreshments, maybe grab you a snack. Stick around, because the next part is where the tension really shows up.
Well, you know what time it is. Every old country gathering had that moment. The basket made its way down the aisle. It's how the lights stayed on and the doors stayed open. These days, it looks a little different. If this video brought you any value, follow over on Rumble. Share it with someone who might need it. If you want to support directly, there's PayPal for a one-time gift, Ko-Fi for a few extras, and Patreon for the deeper content that doesn't always fit neatly here. And if all you can do is share it, that matters more than you think. Thank you. Truly. Alright, back to the show.
Alrighty, folks, this is where we need to tap the brakes, slow down a bit. Because up to this point, we've talked about what Teen Mania was and what it taught. Now we're stepping into something a little heavier. This is the part where stories start to diverge, where one person says, "That changed my life for the better," and another says, "That was one of the most damaging experiences I've ever had." So what we're going to do here is keep our footing. No jumping to conclusions. No brushing things off either. We're going to separate this into 3 lanes. What's confirmed, what's widely reported but not legally proven, and what's more subjective, based on personal experience. Because if you don't separate those, everything gets blurred. Let's start with what we can say with confidence, no debate, no speculation. First, financial collapse. Teen Mania shut down in 2015 after filing for bankruptcy. They were in serious debt. Millions of dollars, negative assets, campus foreclosures. That's all public record. That part of the story is clear. Something structurally was not sustainable. Second, this was a high-intensity environment. That's not an accusation. That's acknowledged across the board. Even people who defend Teen Mania will tell you it was intense. We're talking long hours, strict schedules, and heavy expectations. And especially inside the Honor Academy, this wasn't casual. This wasn't show up when you feel like it. This was structured, disciplined, and demanding. Third, students carried a lot of the operational load. Interns weren't just learning, they were working, running events, handling logistics, supporting missions. That's been consistently reported and confirmed. Now, again, some people saw that as hands-on training. Others saw it as exploitation. But the workload itself, that part is real. Alright, now we move into the second lane. Things that are widely reported but not legally settled across the board. This is where you start hearing about the training exercises, and this is probably the most talked about part of Teen Mania today. Former participants describe things like boot camp style drills, sleep deprivation, physically demanding challenges, simulated persecution scenarios, exercises designed to push people past their comfort limit. Now, to be clear, Teen Mania did not deny that intense training took place. Their framing was, this is character development. This is preparing you for real-world hardship. And this is voluntary. But the experiences people report, they vary. Some say, that pushed me in a good way. Others say that went too far. There are also reports of injuries, things like exhaustion, people getting physically overwhelmed, and in some cases, situations that participants later described as unsafe. But here's where we need to stay grounded. There were not widespread criminal convictions tied to these claims. Now, that doesn't automatically mean nothing happened, but it does mean we have to be careful about what we state as fact versus testimony. Now we move into the third lane, and this is where things get the most complex, because we're talking about internal experience, psychological and spiritual impact, and this is where people's stories really start to split. Many former participants describe what they call emotional and psychological pressure. They talk about feeling constantly evaluated, feeling like they had to prove their commitment, feeling like they couldn't say no, a sense that if they pushed back, they were being rebellious, or worse, lacking faith. Now, again, we need to be precise. That's not something you can measure the same way you measure a financial record. That's lived experience. But when you hear similar descriptions from a large number of people, well, it's worth paying attention to. And then there's what some have called spiritual pressure. This ideal that if you're struggling, it's a spiritual issue. If you're resisting, it's a heart issue. If you're uncomfortable, it might be God breaking you. Now, that kind of language exists in broader believers' circles too. But in a high-intensity environment, it can hit differently. Because now you're not just wrestling internally, you're in a system that reinforces that interpretation. Some former students say they experience what they now identify as spiritual abuse. Others would strongly reject that label and say, no, that was discipline. That was growth. And here's the honest tension. Both of those perspectives exist at the same time. There are also accounts of what people describe as identity breakdown, where you're stripped of your sense of independence so that you can rebuild it around the mission. Again, some see that as transformation. Others see that as control. And then there's the question of coercion. Did people feel like they had a real choice? Or did they feel like saying no meant failing spiritually? That's not something you can easily prove in a courtroom, but it shows up consistently in personal accounts. So now let's back up. Let's zoom out for a second. Because it's easy at this point to swing too far in one direction. Either this was all abusive, or this was all just misunderstood. Reality is usually more complicated than that, and in this case, it clearly is. There are people who went through Teen Mania and came out stronger, more disciplined, more committed to their faith. They look back on it and say, that shaped me in a positive way. And then there are others who came out with anxiety, spiritual confusion, a need to rebuild their understanding of God and authority. And they say that took years to unpack. Same environment, very different outcomes. So, what do we do with that? We recognize that high-intensity systems amplify everything. the good and the bad. If the structure is healthy, that intensity can produce growth. If the structure is off, even slightly, that same intensity can magnify the problems. And that's really the key takeaway. Not just what happened, but how the system functioned. Because once you understand that, you're in a much better position to answer the question we're going to tackle next. And that is, was Teen Mania a cult? Was it something in that direction? Or is that label just people trying to make sense of a complicated experience? We're going to break that down carefully in the final stretch of this episode. No shortcuts, no buzzwords. Just a clear look at what that label actually means and whether it fits. Don't go nowhere, stick around. We'll bring this ride home.
Yeah. This one's for the ones who were there. And the ones who felt something was off but couldn't quite name it. Babbling on in Babylon, let's talk about it. Back in the day, stadium lights, hands in the air, kids in the crowd like, God, I know you're there. Speakers shouting, you were born for this fight. Tears hit the floor in the middle of the night. A quiet, a fire, yeah, the name said it plain. Whole generation trying to break every chain. Not playing church, not living lukewarm. They said this right here is the height of storm. Mission trips, passports, stand with belief. Preaching in the streets, trying to bring that relief. Felt like purpose, felt like truth in the chest. Like maybe for once we ain't second best. Fire in the arena, hearts on the line. We were told this was the end of time. Stand up, don't fold, don't run, don't bend. But nobody told us where the line might end. Arena, voices all shout. Some found faith, some burned out. Truth or pressure, hard to find when you're walking that razor line. They said surrender everything, don't hold back. Carry that cross like a weight on your back. If it don't cost you, it probably ain't real. That's what they said, that's what we'd feel. Holiness talk, purity code. Watch every step down the narrow road. Guard your mind, guard your eyes. Every little thought could be compromised. Battle language, yeah, we soldiers now. Fighting the world, but we didn't know how. Culture's the enemy, stand your ground. Truth gets loud when the drums start pounding. But here's where it shifts. Cause when everything's a battle, when every thought's under fire, you stop asking, is this true? And you start asking, am I failing? Honor Academy, lines drawn tight, long days, no sleep. Push through the night, break you down just to build you up. Drink that pressure from a paper cup. Say yes, don't question, stay in line. If it feels off, that's your heart, not mine. Lead or speak, you don't push back. Doubt looks a lot like a faith attack. Some came out strong, sharper than steel. Others still trying to learn how to feel. Same fire, same place, same sound. Some found God, some just broke down. Fire in the arena, still hear the sound. Some got lifted, some got drowned. Truth or pressure, who decides when the voice of God and man collide? So what was it then? Let's call it straight. Not all evil, but it carried weight. Not all lies, but not all clean. Some were tangled in the in-between. No secret code, no hidden book, but a heavy hand if you really look. High demand, high control tone. Hard to tell where you stood alone. Was it faith? Was it fear? Was it clarity? Or just unclear? When the system's tight and the pressure's loud, you don't stand out, you blend in the crowd. Every generation wants something real, not plastic faith, not fake appeal. So when something burns, yeah, we run to the flame, but fire don't always play it safe. Fire in the arena still burns bright, but not every flame gives off light. Stand your burn, but know that line. Truth don't fear a question in mind. Fire in the arena, hear that call, but don't lose yourself in it all. Faith ain't forced and it ain't blind. You don't need change just to be refined. Yeah. See, the point ain't to tear it all down, it's to see clearly, to know the difference between conviction and control, between truth and pressure dressed like it. Stay awake at it. Battle burns loud. Don't let it do your thinking for you.
Alright, let's bring the bike home and draw this ride to its end. We've ridden through what the Teen Mania was, what it taught, and what people say happened inside of it. Now we get to the question that tends to hang over everything like a cloud. Was it a cult? Or is that label a little too easy? Now, before we even try to answer that, we need to define what we're talking about. Because cult is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, like fascist and Nazi. And half the time, people mean completely different things when they say it. For some people, cult just means, I disagree with this group. For others, it means a high-controlled system that manipulates people. And for others, it's something even more extreme. So let's tighten that up a bit. When people seriously study this stuff, psychologists, sociologists, they tend to look for patterns like control over behavior, control over information, control over thinking, control over emotions. Not necessarily all at once, but enough of those working together to limit a person's independence. So the question becomes, did Teen Mania operate like that? And the honest answer is, not cleanly one way or the other. Let's start with why some people say yes. There are certain characteristics that overlap with what's called a high control group. Strong authority structure, emphasis on obedience, limited pushback, heavy accountability, intense group environment. Inside the Honor Academy especially, you had structured schedules, leadership hierarchy, expectations around behavior and attitude, a culture that encouraged conformity to the mission. And then you layer on emotional intensity, spiritual language tied to obedience, a sense that leaving or resisting might reflect a deeper issue in your heart. That combination, it can start to feel controlling, especially to someone on the inside. That's why you'll hear former participants say, "It felt like I lost myself," or "I didn't feel like I could think independently." Now, that doesn't automatically make something a cult, but it does put it in the conversation. On the other side, you've got some very important counterpoints. Teen Mania didn't have a secret doctrine. They didn't claim exclusive access to truth. They weren't isolated from the broader world in the way some groups are. People could leave, and many did, without being chased down or cut off from everyone they knew. And the core beliefs? They were standard evangelical theology. Nothing hidden, nothing uniquely theirs. So it doesn't fit the classic textbook definition of a cult. Not in the way most people think of one. What it does fit, more accurately, is something in the middle. A high-intensity, high-demand religious movement with some high control tendencies in certain environments. And that's not as catchy of a label, but it's more precise. Because here's the thing. You can have something that is well-intentioned, rooted in real belief, doing real good in some people's lives, and still have structural issues that cause harm in other people's lives. Those two things can exist at the same time, and that's what makes this uncomfortable. Because we like clean categories: good or bad, right or wrong, safe or dangerous. But real life, it tends to be messier than that. Now let's bring this back to something bigger. Because Teen Mania isn't just a story about one ministry that rose and fell. It's a pattern, and you see this pattern repeat over and over again. A generation feels like things are slipping. They want something real, something strong, something that actually demands something from them. And then a movement shows up and says, "Here it is. This is what you've been looking for." And it works for a while. But if that movement doesn't have healthy accountability, balanced leadership, room for questioning, and clarity between God's voice and human authority, then over time, well, things can start to drift. Not always intentionally, but gradually. And that's where wisdom and discernment comes in. Because the goal isn't to become cynical. It's not to say, well, everything is corrupt, so nothing matters. The goal is discernment. To be able to say, this part is good, this part is questionable, and this part I need to be careful with. Because at the end of the day, your walk with Yeshua is not supposed to be controlled by a system. It's supposed to be guided by truth, by the light, by the way. And yeah, that truth will challenge you. It will stretch you, and it will call you higher. But it won't manipulate you. It won't trap you. And it won't require you to shut off your ability to think, question, and seek. So when you look at something like Teen Mania, was it good or bad? Ask better questions. What was driving it? What fruit did it produce? Where did it stay grounded? And where did it drift? And what can I learn from it moving forward? Because whether you realize it or not, there are always new versions of this kind of movement rising up. Different name, different style, same underlying dynamics. I remember the Jesus movement. Remember that? They even recently made a movie about it. Back in the 70s, 80s, and the whole revivals that were so popular at the turn of the century. If you don't learn to recognize those patterns, you're just going to keep running into the same situations over and over again. All right, that's where we're going to wrap this one up. Park the bike. Make sure you stay tuned for the post-rent after show, where we'll continue this conversation a little more casually, frankly, and off script. And also be featuring a few video clips from someone who actually was involved in this Teen Mania movement when they were younger, during the 90s. What they have to say about it. So come join us over on the Patreon for the post-rant after show. If this got you to thinking, and I hope it did, take some time with it. Don't just accept what I said. Look into it. Pray on it. Test it. And as always, keep your eyes open. Keep your footing steady. And don't let Babylon do your thinking for you. Make sure you read your Bibles. I sure do appreciate you sticking around for the whole show, the whole episode. Makes you quite a soldier in your own right. And don't take that the wrong way. This has been Babbling On in Babylon. I'm Will, and Abba willing, I'll catch you in the next one. Shalom, shalom.
In a world that seems to spin faster every day, where truth feels fragile, and anger fills the spaces where love used to live, remember this: God's light still breaks through the noise. It shines through every honest word, every act of mercy, every moment we choose prayer instead of pride. Nations will argue, kings will fall, but his kingdom, the one written not on paper, but on our hearts, stands forever. So keep your eyes on that light. Keep your heart soft even when the world grows cold. And when the night feels long, just whisper, though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. Until next time, keep the faith, keep watching, and keep riding toward the kingdom. Shalom.